Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thanks so much for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm pleased to welcome Eric Weiner to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speakers Series. He's here to discuss his latest book, The Geography of Genius, in which we learn how certain urban settings are conducive to ingenuity. Eric is the author of 2 other books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Geography of Bliss. He has reported in more than 36 countries, and his work has appeared on NPR and in many publications, including Slate and the New York Times Magazine. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Amy. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Great. So let's clear the air right off the bat. When you write a book with the word genius in the title, the first question everyone wants to know is, am I a genius? And I am here to tell you, no, I am not. And I've got plenty of friends and others who will vouch for the fact that I am not a genius. But that kind of puts me in a minority these days because the word is bandied about rather promiscuously. We have marketing geniuses, and we have football geniuses and political geniuses. Maybe not so much this season, but in the past we've probably had political geniuses. And we use it a lot, but have we deflated its meaning? I think we have a bit. And what does it mean anyway? Let's define our terms. It comes to us, as so many words do, from the Latin, but back in Roman times, you were not a genius, you had a genius. It's the same root that we get the word genie from. It was like this supernatural being, this spirit that animated you and followed you around everywhere. And then along came the Renaissance and Michelangelo, and then the Romantics, and then genius is something that you could become, almost like this godlike figure. I want to tell you what I do not mean by genius, to clarify matters. I don't just mean someone who's smart with a high IQ, because there are plenty of people with very high IQs, like Marilyn von Sant, not to pick on her, but she has an IQ of 220, possibly the highest ever recorded, and she hasn't done all that much. She has a nice column in Parade magazine. Then there's William Shockley, who had an IQ of only 140, who went on to invent the transistor and win the Nobel Prize. So I'm not talking about genius as raw intelligence measured on an IQ test. I'm talking about creative genius, creating something that might earn you a patent. And it turns out that the patent office has a nice little definition for genius, or at least to get a patent. You have to invent something that is new, surprising, and useful. So let's imagine a coffee mug. Does anyone have a coffee mug on them? Okay, no. So picture a coffee mug. If I were to invent a coffee mug that is fluorescent orange, in a fluorescent orange shade no one has used before, like that, that would be new, vaguely surprising, not particularly useful. If I were to invent a coffee mug, picture this with no bottom. New, definitely. Surprising, oh yes. Not so useful. But now say I invented a folding coffee mug that doubles as a flash drive and a Wi-Fi hotspot. Now we're talking patent and we're talking genius. One of my favorite quotes that sort of says it all about genius is from the German philosopher Schopenhauer. He said, talent hits a target no one can hit. Talent hits a target no one can hit. Genius hits a target no one can see. And I would add to that that once the genius hits the target that no one else saw, everyone else has to see it. Otherwise, you're just some guy hitting invisible targets, and we have a word for that. It's called crazy. So I'm very serious here. I do think that genius is largely a social verdict. A genius is someone who we declare a genius. Otherwise, you're delusional and crazy until society decides that you have created something worthy of the title of genius. Now, hopefully we get that right. We get that social verdict right, and we choose people like Mozart and Beethoven and Einstein and people whose creations do last through the ages. I realize that's a little bit controversial, and I wrestled with that definition for a while myself, but I really have come to believe it. I call it the fashionista theory of genius because in a way it's looking at genius as fashion. Is there good fashion and bad fashion? You know, in the 1970s, people thought wide ties and leisure suits were good fashion. We outgrew that. Okay, that's our working definition of creative genius. But what my book is really about is not what is genius, but where does it come from? And we've got two major myths, I think, when it comes to genius. And I use the term myth to mean not something that's completely untrue, or certainly not something that's useless, because myths can serve a very useful function, right? As Joseph Campbell taught us. But I'm talking about theories and ideas about genius that are not completely accurate yet we've bought into them. One is that geniuses are born. And this is a very popular one, that the genius just pops out of the womb, completely formed and brilliant. And probably the poster child for the genius is born myth is Mozart, you know, who was playing the piano at age 3, composing at age 7 or 8, and we think, my God, it must be genetic. Ignoring the fact that he was born into an extremely musical family, that his father, Leopold, was one of the great violin instructors in all of Europe at the time. Then he was living in a time and a place in Austria that was one of the musical ever. You know, and psychologists now estimate that genetics make up somewhere between 10 and 20% of the genius puzzle, the genius pie. That's not insignificant. It does matter. Just like the seed matters. You can't grow an apple tree without the seed to start off with. But let's move on to a second myth, and that is that geniuses are made through hard work. Edison famously said, you know, genius is 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. And more recently, you've probably heard of the 10,000-hour theory. You got to put in 10,000 hours at least to achieve mastery, if not genius. And that's true. You need to water that seed to grow the apple tree. I don't deny the importance of hard work. But there are plenty of hard-working people with good genes in North Korea, but very few geniuses are emerging from there. Why? It's because I believe geniuses are not born or made. They are grown in the soil. The soil that the seed is planted in matters a lot. And we tend not to look at that as much, partly because we have this very romantic notion of the genius as someone who works in isolation and is somehow free-floating, not tethered to their time and place at all, and that is utterly untrue. Geniuses are grown in the soil, and the soil matters. I mean, just look at a map historically of, let's imagine a world map there, and you were to plot where geniuses have appeared over time. You wouldn't just find one in Bolivia, one in Siberia, and one in Bellingham, Washington. I don't know why Bellingham, Washington popped into my mind, but it did. And you know, you would find these groupings, these genius clusters, certain places at certain times that produce a mother lode of brilliant minds and good ideas. And the question I set out to answer in this book is why? What was in the water, and can we bottle it? And what can we learn from it? This book is partly selfish, as all books are, right? As I said, I'm not a genius. It's too late for me, but it's not too late for the city I live in, Washington, D.C. Maybe it is too late for Washington. But it's not too late for my daughter, my 11-year-old daughter, you know, who's brimming with potential. And, you know, I may not be Pericles, ruler of Athens, and I'm not even ruler of my house, but I have a lot of influence over the culture of my home and of my neighborhood. And I maybe have the ability to cultivate a place of genius for her. So I identified 7 genius clusters, the sort of 7 genius wonders of the world, you might say. And I realized I could have come up with many more. This could be a 3,000-page book very easily, but I had to make decisions. And I chose a sort of cross-section of places. I chose some familiar to most readers, which were classical Athens, Renaissance Florence, some moderately familiar, Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment of the 18th century, or is it sometimes known the Scotch Enlightenment, because they drank a lot. Vienna, musical Vienna and Freudian Vienna. That city experienced a rare double dip of genius. And then I chose some places that are, I think, off the map for many, if not all, readers, such as Hangzhou, China in the 13th century, which was the capital of the Song Dynasty, which was an amazing place and definitely a golden age, and Calcutta, which I think would surprise most non-Indian readers, and maybe even some Indian readers, that this city that is today so associated with poverty and despair was in fact very much a genius cluster in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And then what did I do? Well, you know, my style is a bit unusual. This book doesn't fit into a category. It's a little bit travelogue, it's a little bit history, it's a little bit social science, it's a little bit of a meditation. But I did travel to these places. And the question is, why bother? Because the Athens of today is not the Athens of 450 BC, and that's true. But I do believe there is great value in going someplace. I mean, why would any of us travel anywhere? It's all available online. We can Skype. Is Skype Microsoft? Am I safe with that? Okay, good. You got to be careful what you say about products. Why go anywhere? But in fact, these walking literally in the footsteps of a Socrates or of a Leonardo da Vinci and literally touching the ground and the stone that they touched does provide portholes to the past. And I'll be honest, I was told the F word is okay at Microsoft, but this book is fun. That's the word I'm talking about. It is fun, okay? There's no reason why we can't treat a serious topic like creative genius in a fun way. So I want to take you on a quick, just little sampling of some of the places I went to and some of the observations, and then open it up into questions, because if there's anything I learned about creative genius, it is that it is a conversation. And I want to turn this into a conversation. So first stop was Athens, and I land there. And what strikes me right away is the light. There's something about Greek light, in particular Athenian light, that's stark, that is stunning, actually. So I'm jet-lagged and a bit out of it, and I think, well, maybe it was the light. Maybe sunshine explains genius. But no, that would not explain Shakespeare's Elizabethan London, nor would it explain Seattle. Plug for local rainy city. It's true. It's not weather systems. In fact, if anything, the first thing I learned about Athens is that it was not an easy place. If you were to time travel back to 500 BC, look at the hundreds of Greek city-states and try to pick which one would rise above all the others, you would not pick Athens. Other city-states were bigger or wealthier or stronger militarily, right? Athens, the land was barren, not much grew. This is a theme of all these places, is that they're not easy. There's always something to push against. So, this is one of the facts of creative genius, is that it thrives where there is a challenge. That creativity is a response to a challenge. That we actually need constraints in order to be creative. Robert Frost once said that writing free verse poetry would be like playing tennis without a net. We need those boundaries, we need those constraints. A musician, I believe it was Brian Eno, said that the electric guitar is a very dumb instrument. It just does a few things well. So the good electric guitarist channels all their creative energy into those few things. What else might explain why Athens, of all those Greek city-states, flourished the way it did? Well, there was the wine, seriously. They drank. They didn't have coffee, which I know, as Seattleites, you must be shocked that they produced democracy and theater and so much with no coffee, but it's true. But they had wine, and first of all, they watered it down, 5 parts water to 2 parts wine, knowing perhaps instinctually what we know today through research, which is a little bit of alcohol does increase divergent thinking skills, that is creative thinking skills, and a lot of alcohol makes you fall down. It's not good. But more important than the wine that they drank in these large, shallow cups called craters, which encouraged sipping and not gulping, was that they did it together in what was called a symposia. Symposia is a Greek word that means literally drinking together. Next time you're attending a professional symposium, keep that in mind. But it was the conversation. Another thread that I see in all these places is a place to come together where you can converse, where there are no boundaries, where no topics are off limits, and that sort of thing. They also walked a lot, and that might seem insignificant, but it's not. Aristotle founded the peripatetic school of walking, which means of philosophy rather, walking and talking, walking and thinking. And this is, again, a common thread among many, many geniuses. Charles Dickens would walk through the streets of London in the middle of the night, turning over the plot of A Christmas Carol or whatever novel or story he was working on at the time. Mark Twain was a pacer, pacing back and forth until suddenly, as his daughter recounted once, it was as if a new spirit entered the room and he was unstuck. And in fact, recent research at Stanford University shows that you put people on a treadmill for 15 or 20 minutes, treadmill, not even outside, staring at a blank wall. After as little as 15 or 20 minutes, they will come up with more creative ideas than someone who had spent that 15 or 20 minutes sitting in a chair. There's something about the act of putting one step in front of the other that encourages creative thinking. Ultimately, though, the dirty little secret about Athens, in addition to the fact that it was kind of a dump, even for its time, the living conditions were poor for its time, again, constraint, something to push against. The dirty little secret is not that much was actually invented there. They borrowed statue making from the Egyptians, mathematics from elsewhere, but as Plato said, what the Greeks borrow from foreigners, they perfect. What the Greeks borrow from foreigners, they perfect. And so if you're looking for the secret of Athenian genius, I would point to the sailing ships. They reached out to other lands. They had an open immigration policy. They were called metics, these resident aliens as we'd call them today. And Pericles, the leader of Athens, even said at the time, and I'm paraphrasing here, you know, we know this is kind of crazy. There might be enemies amongst these people, but it's worth the risk. I mean, the overtones for our current debate over immigration are pretty obvious, but I looked at some depth about why it is that so many of these genius clusters have what I would call openness to experience. That, in fact, is the trait that psychologists have identified as the single most important trait for any person, for any creative person, is openness to experience. And that's true individually, and I believe it's also true on the societal level for these places. But why? What is it about immigration that makes someone like an Einstein or a Freud or a Marie Curie, on one level, more likely to become a genius? You know, the traditional narrative about the immigrant success story is that they come to this country or any country and they're motivated, right? They're hungry, so they work harder and they often have the support of their family. Now that would certainly explain their success, but it wouldn't explain those creative leaps that are required of any genius, and they make these leaps. So I think I found an answer in something called a schema violation. A schema violation is a psychological term that means when your world is turned upside down, either spatially or temporally. So having pancakes for dinner would be a kind of schema violation, or preparing the pancakes in a backwards order, or even watching someone you can identify with, that's key, watching them do something backwards. Again, in the lab, then they find that these people who have been exposed to schema violations have more creative ideas. Well, think about it. An immigrant, their life is one giant schema violation. And there's something else going on. It's not just that the immigrant is likely to be more creative than a non-immigrant. There's a kind of contagion effect, that creativity is contagious. Because what happens when you look at a country like Japan, it's traditionally been closed for most of its history, but with occasional openings. And there's been a very rigorous empirical study by a professor named Dean Simonton at UC Davis who looked at this. And he looked at Japan from about 800 AD to 1950. And he found a direct correlation between their openness and their achievement in the arts and science, et cetera. they didn't have enough immigrants to explain it. I think what's going on is that when you open, you're used to drinking water or whatever it is in a certain way, or say using a fork and knife. You think there's no other way to eat your food. Then along comes someone using chopsticks, or someone from South India using their hands. And you're like, wow, I never thought there was any other way to eat except with a fork and a knife. Now, you're probably not going to switch to chopsticks or your hands, but your mind has been opened to what I call the possibility of possibility. And I think that's the real value of immigration, is it opens our mind to the possibility of possibility. So what they borrowed from foreigners, they perfected, and that reminded me an awful lot of Silicon Valley, where not a lot has been invented, but a lot has been perfected. Goethe said, essentially, we're all plagiarists, and we might as well admit it. Newton said it another way. He could see so far by standing on the shoulders of giants. There's nothing wrong with borrowing with a little bit of credit, perhaps. I'm not sure if the Athenians gave people credit. But let's move on, because I want to make sure I have time for questions. We're just going to touch upon some other places. Let's jump to Florence, Italy, another well-known place. Now, I subtitled that chapter, Genius is Expensive. Intentionally provocative, because we don't normally think of genius and money as having much to do with one another. We think of the starving artist, the genius being beyond money, and the genius may be beyond money in a way, but not these genius clusters. In fact, they do need money, a certain amount anyway, to thrive. But the money must be leveraged in a wise way. And nobody leveraged that money better than the Medicis, the patrons of Florence. And I just want to tell you a brief story about one of the Medicis named Lorenzo de' Medici, aka Lorenzo the Magnificent. I'm not sure if others called him that or that was self-declared, but it was on his business card, so it's got to be true. And he was the chief dude at the time, to use a technical term. He was, like many of the Medicis, though, he was not just a patron of the art, he was a poet, and a pretty good one. And he was a diplomat. But most of all, he was a talent scout. He was good at spotting talent. And one day he's walking outside the palace grounds, and he notices in the garden there a young stonecutter, not more than 14 years old, hammering away at a statue of a faun, a Roman god. They did lots of replicas of Roman and Greek gods. And it was pretty good, pretty good. And Lorenzo says to the kid, that's pretty good, but you got the teeth all wrong. It's an older faun, but the teeth are perfect, and that's not really what happens in the real world. Lorenzo walks away, comes back the next day, and notices that the kid has fixed the teeth, and now they're incredibly decayed and realistic. And Lorenzo says in so many words, hey kid, you got talent. Come live with me. Literally live with me, almost as a family member. Lorenzo gives them the best teachers, the best material in the land. And it was an investment, and it turned out to be a very wise investment, because today that kid's best known by his first name, Michelangelo. Now, who was the genius? We think Michelangelo was the genius, but I would argue that it was Lorenzo, and more than that, it was the Medicis, and more than that, it was the city of Florence that was actually the co-genius in a way, because there was an audience for the art in Florence, and genius requires an audience. You cannot separate the creative act from the recognition of the creative act. I really do believe that. You saw that in Florence. You saw that in Vienna, in musical Vienna, where Mozart was prodded, encouraged. I'm not sure what the right verb is, but he had a demanding audience. Everyone was musical, from Emperor Franz Joseph down to the street sweeper. So in a way, you can argue that those musical people of Vienna, or the artistic-minded people of Florence, were co-geniuses along with the geniuses themselves. It's not just a one-way street. The genius creates, and we passively receive it. Let me talk a bit about a couple of other places. Let's talk about Edinburgh for a second, and then I'll go to one least expected one, and then we'll take questions. So Edinburgh was a surprise because in about 1740, were you to visit Edinburgh for some reason, you would find it, and I quote from one historian, inconvenient, dirty, old-fashioned, alcoholic, quarrelsome, and poor. Ouch. On the edge of the world, small population of 45,000. Just got swallowed up by England, didn't have a lot going for them. But over the next 50 years, Edinburgh would go on to become one of the seats of the Enlightenment, a place that, as Jefferson said, no place, Thomas Jefferson that is, no place in the world can pretend to competition with Edinburgh. Benjamin Franklin visited often and was impressed by the city, loved the city. In fact, if you were to point to one city that explains the way we Americans are today, it would be Edinburgh of the 18th century. You had Adam Smith, the founder of economics, Adam Ferguson, the founder of sociology, James Watt with his steam engine, David Hume, the philosopher, and there were poets like Robert Ferguson, and it goes on and on. And it was a very practical form of genius in Edinburgh. They were improvers. They were very much interested in making something better. James Watt didn't invent the steam engine, he perfected the steam engine. Very Athenian, I guess, in a way. And again, it was very social. Not only social. David Hume is a good example. He's a philosopher. He would lock himself up in the room for days on end and engage in these thought experiments, just literally inside his own head. And then after 3 or 4 days of this, he wrote in his diary, I had to get out and get to the pub and be with other people. I had this fierce need for socializing. So there's always this toggling back and forth with the genius, I think, between going off into nature, having insights, but then returning to a social setting, almost always a city, in order to consolidate those insights. That's what Hume did, and they consolidated those insights in these clubs. The clubs were weird places, like the 717 Club. They only met at 7:17 p.m. I don't know why. There was the 6-foot Club, where, as you guessed it, you had to be at least 6 feet tall, which was kind of not that easy back then, right? People were shorter. My favorite was the Oyster Club, founded by Adam Smith and David Hume. They would go to a cellar every Friday afternoon, eat oysters, which was actually considered peasant food at the time, drink claret, red wine, and discuss. David Hume would declare something conversible, and once it was, the discussion happened, and they engaged in something called flyting, a word that I had never heard of until I went to Edinburgh. Flyting, F-L-Y-T-I-N-G, is, and I'm quoting here from historian Tom Devine, it's defined as ritual humiliation of your opponent by verbal violence. Ouch! And I say to Tom, it sounds brutal. He's like, oh yes, it is, with a Scottish gleam in his eye. But the key to flyting, and is after you've committed this ritual humiliation of your opponent by verbal violence, is that you go to the pub and you have a pint or 10, because it's no hard feelings. Everything is, everything's allowed to be said, but no one is wounded afterwards. And it's that kind of free flow of conversation that I do believe is essential to creative genius. I also talk about something in Edinburgh that I noticed, but it's true everywhere, called compensatory genius, which is just the idea that these geniuses almost always have a buddy who compensates for their shortcomings, or who just might be a comrade in arms so they don't feel like they're quite as crazy as they might be otherwise. Freud had a friend named Wilhelm Fleiss, who was also a physician. They had a long friendship and correspondence. Both had strange ideas. Freud had these crazy ideas about dreams and the unconscious, which were dismissed as fairy tales by his colleagues at the time. Wilhelm Fleiss had strange ideas about the nose. He believed it was the most important organ in the body and that it was actually a sexual organ. I'm not making this up. And he performed surgery on people to improve their psyche by operating on their nose. Now, Fleiss was, as Freud eventually concluded, nuts. But Freud wasn't, at least not as crazy. And but he needed that fellow conquistador, he said, someone to bounce his ideas off of. And in 18th century Scotland, there was an incredible geologist, the world's first geologist, named James Hutton, who posited this crazy idea that maybe the Earth is a bit older than 6,000 years, as the Bible says. Up until then, that's what everyone believed, or was told, because that's what the Bible said. So he did a lot of field research, wrote it up in a paper. The problem was that Hutton was a terrible, terrible writer. It was turgid, it was unreadable. And, but he had a friend named John Playfair who was a good writer, who took that turgid prose and turned it into something readable, something that Hutton presented to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, something that eventually landed in the hands of one young botanist named Charles Darwin, who used that research to form his theories of natural selection and evolution, compensatory genius. I want to end, before we go to discussion, I did say there were some places that were off the map, at least for Western readers, and so let's go to Hangzhou. So Hangzhou in the 13th century was a city of more than 1 million people. Think about that. In the 13th century, a city of more than 1 million people. The biggest city in Europe at the time was maybe 50,000. So while the Europeans are living in tiny hamlets, picking lice out of their hair and wondering when the Middle Ages are ever going to end, God, it's just going on forever. The Chinese under the Song dynasty are inventing the compass, are sailing huge 400-man ships, are writing sublime poetry, painting beautifully, are ruled by poet emperors. I loved when I stumbled across this hyphenation. I thought it was one of the greatest hyphenations of all times. The poet emperor. They were better at poetry than emperor, as it turns out, and ultimately the Mongols invaded still for a while, though it was amazing. And Marco Polo traveled there and was hugely impressed. Now, I use the Chinese, and I travel there, of course, in the present day, and I use it as a way to do a couple things. To explore this incredible flowering that was 13th century Hangzhou, but also to look at the differences between the Chinese approach to creativity and the Western approach. And there is a different approach because I believe our creative instincts, for lack of a better term, are really rooted in our creation mythologies. We live in a Judeo-Christian culture. Whether or not you're religious, that's a fact. So we tend to believe in creation ex nihilo, literally from nothing, that the creator creates everything from art to software, sort of just poof, out of nothing. That you can create something out of nothing, right? We believe that. But in China, in their creation mythology, there's always been something, always. And so what the creator is doing is, in a way, rearranging or illuminating what is already there. And that's not less important. As the historian Will Durant said, nothing is new but the arranging, which is nothing to get depressed about, because there can be great importance and beauty in arranging things. And the Chinese approach is more, we talked about the coffee mug and the, new, useful, surprising. We really focus on new and surprising, that novelty, shock effect for something to be declared creative. It's got to really smack us in the head. In China and in Confucian cultures like China, it is more a matter of usefulness. If something's not useful, they will not consider it really creative. And they see creativity as standing on the firm ground of tradition. And in fact, I really do believe all creativity is based on tradition. That, if you're going to be creative, you need not only an accelerator, you need a rear view mirror. You need to know where you've been to know where you're going. And, if I were to invent, again, I'll stay with the coffee mug analogy for now, a coffee mug that was so unlike any coffee mug anyone had ever seen before, you wouldn't know what to do with it. It would be incomprehensible, right? And we live in a bit of the myth of new and improved. Cars come out every year that are new and improved, and they're neither, and we know it, but we sort of play along with that. Chinese less so. And I want to end with talking with I might even read a very short bit. I don't know if that's against the rules. It won't take very long at all, and then we'll go to questions. I want to talk about one of the reasons I think that Hangzhou was so special, and why I don't think we're living in a golden age of creative genius today. So this is just a very short bit, and then I'll go to questions. I want to tell you about a painter, governor, amazing person named Su Dongpo. He was an engineer and a governor and an artist, and he did all these things that, today you would find in 10 different people. So I step out of this small museum that shows some of his work in the Hangzhou, right on this beautiful lake called Shihu, or West Lake, to a brightening sky, and I find myself wondering why there aren't more people like that, like Su Dongpo today. Why must we sequester our ambitions? I answer my own question by imagining what would happen if a polymath like Su walked onto a modern college campus. Is it literature you're interested in, Mr. Su? Then please, see the School of Humanities. Oh, what's that? You're a painter? Well, please drop by the Department of Fine Arts. What's that? It's engineering that piques your interest. I see. Well, we have an excellent school for that, too. But I want to do it all, says Su. I'm sorry, Mr. Su, we can't help you there. Please return when you've clarified your career objectives. Meanwhile, if you like, I can direct you to mental health services. We don't often question the rationale of specialization. Of course, there was less specialization back then, a friend said at a dinner party. The world was less complicated. Yes, it was. But I would argue that the world was less complicated because there was less specialization. The specialist is encouraged, rewarded for parsing his or her chosen field into smaller and smaller morsels, then building high walls around those tiny bits. A narrow outlook naturally follows. We mourn the death of the Renaissance man, oblivious to the blindingly obvious fact that we killed him and continue to do so every day on college campuses and, in corporate offices across the land. Gee, on that bummer of a note, but I do believe that specialization is one of the enemies of creative genius, that all these geniuses I looked at in all these places of genius, what they excelled at was making connections and seeing not only targets that others don't see, but seeing connections that others don't see. Einstein was not a know-it-all. There were physicists during his day who knew more physics than Einstein did. What Einstein was a see-it-all. And what I'd like to see is fewer know-it-alls and more see-it-alls, and I think the world would be a better place. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you. Yes.
Can you talk to us about your process? What sparked the idea for this book, and then how did you go about building it? Had you visited all these places already, and you just...
Okay, good question. I'm interested in big ideas and places and how they intersect. And I'll be honest, I had written about happiness and God, and those were two big ideas. And it struck me that what else do you need to lead a fulfilled, self-actualized life? And creativity is a huge part of it. And I felt like someone needed to sort of correct what I saw as a myth about, or these two myths about where creativity and genius come from. So that was my interest in addition to selfishly wanting my daughter to be the next Marie Curie. How I went about it, I began all my projects from a place of ignorance, which I think is a good place to start. I didn't talk about the importance of ignorance in creative genius, but I think it's hugely important. Sure, I knew something about these places, and I had been to a couple of them, not many though. Actually, I don't know if I'd been to any of them. Well-traveled, but I haven't been to these places. And I dove into the research, but I researched not the products. We tend to just look at, you go to the Uffizi Museum in Florence, you can see the products of the Renaissance. It tells you absolutely nothing about the process, about the bottegas, the workshops where Leonardo did an apprenticeship and these things. So I really looked into the historical process, and I read a lot of social science papers, so you don't have to. And there is a whole field of creatology, the science of genius, which is emerging. There's also something called historiometrics, of which Dean Simonton at UC Davis is the grand poobah. And I weaved that all together, and then I got on an airplane and went to these places and tried to find translators, not literal translators, but cultural translators. And I tried to connect what the lab was telling us, the social science research, with the place and the historical. It sounds hard the way now. No wonder I'm tired, but that's what I did. Other questions? Yes.
So I noticed that some places were omitted. I know you had to kind of make decisions, but thinking about, for example, that more than half of the places were in Europe, and places like in Africa or like Central and South America were omitted. So would love to kind of know more about the process, and just given that there's some negative connotations with places like Africa and South America in terms of genius. So how you think that this book might contribute to that dialogue?
Well, I mean, I could have easily not left Western Europe because so many people who we equate with genius, again, we equate with genius were born and raised there. I made an effort, not just an effort, but I wanted to expand the idea of what genius was, thus the trips to China and India. There is one place I wanted to go to, a chapter I wanted to include in the book, but we're not able to, and that was on the Muslim or Arab, well, there was really a Muslim and an Arab golden age that began really within the century after the birth of Islam. I guess we're talking 7th century, and lasted a long time. But really the apex of that was Baghdad and the House of Wisdom around 800 to 1000 AD. And it's not, the fact is it's not safe to go to Baghdad today. I've been there before for NPR as a foreign correspondent. I'll be blunt here. I didn't want my obituary to say author dies while researching book on genius. And that was a disappointment to me that I wasn't able to go there. As far as Africa and Latin America, I mean, I could have, I suppose, found some places. Part of the problem is that genius is really this Western concept that, you know, if geniuses are places we declare to be places of genius, we have undiscovered, unknown genius in Africa or in South America, maybe to a lesser extent. But the historical record isn't there. And I'm not just trying to check off boxes and go everywhere in the world. I realize, as has been said about writing, no writing is ever finished, it's only abandoned. Where do you think I should have gone to or could have gone to in Africa?
I mean, I actually don't know, which is why I'm excited to read this book, but I do think it's an important part of the discussion when I think of kind of the Western discussion about genius and race and ethnicity and culture. And I was wondering how that would contribute to the dialogue and thinking that there's...
Well, I think if people get anything out of my book, it's that creativity is not what we think it is, and there's not only one way to think about it, and that whether it's the way the Athenians saw it, or way the Chinese or the Indians saw it, or the Scots or the people of Silicon Valley, that there are a lot of different ways of thinking about creativity, and that's what I try to contribute to the dialogue. Yes.
Did you find competition playing a role in these creative clusters?
Yes and no. And this was one of the places where the lab research sort of butted up against the real world. So in the psychology lab, there's this theory known as the intrinsic theory of motivation. There's a Harvard psychologist named Teresa Amabile who's the main proponent of it. And basically in study after study, she would get two groups of people, have them build a collage out of material. One group is told, you'll be graded, you'll receive money for the best collage, your collages will be made public. In other words, you're given a lot of what's known as extrinsic motivation. The other group is told just to build the collage and have fun and given intrinsic motivation. And it's the second group that are told just have fun that produce the more creative collages. Yet in the places I look at, you know, like let's take Florence, you know, there was a lot of rivalry in Florence. And Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci hated each other. But it did bring out the best in them. You know, the ancient Greeks believed there were two types of envy, good envy and bad envy. Bad envy ate you up inside, good envy propelled you to do better than your old self. I did come across one fascinating study that is in the book that looked at more experienced artists. Those collage makers tended to be not very experienced, new to the task. But when these psychologists looked at musicians who had at least 5 or 10 years experience, quite accomplished, told them to improvise, it was actually the group that was given a sort of financial incentive and a publicity incentive that did better. So I think that when you're first attempting a task, competition is probably not helpful, but once you attain a degree of mastery, competition can help you up your game. Yes?
So increasingly what we find is that there is social grooming where we're born in a place and our environment shapes us to be who we are. And often in corporations, we have a culture which is as a result of that. So how do you break out of that to get creativity from the different places you've seen? How do these people break out from their social grooming or social clubs in order to come up with the next?
Okay, well, it's an interesting question, but first of all, I would argue that the job is not always for the individual to break out of the culture, but for the culture to be creative enough to recognize the creativity. Like, in other words, we put the onus, by your question, and it's a common way of thinking that it's up to the person to be creative, which means going against the culture. And that always is true, but in these creative places, there's more receptivity to the other, right? The person has to be, in that sense, in the right place at the right time, where there's a receptivity to their idea. And I think, I want to be clear that the people like Socrates and Freud, who thrived in their respective cities of Athens and Vienna, did not necessarily have a always happy relationship with them. Socrates loved Athens to death, literally. They ended up putting him to death. And Freud had very mixed feelings about Vienna. He moved there when he was 4 or 5 years old as an immigrant. And as an immigrant and as a Jew, he was always a bit of an outsider, but not that far outside. He actually had, some professions were closed to him as a Jew, so he couldn't go into military or government, but he could go into medicine. So he channeled his energy in there, and then he was kind of an insider-outsider. So I think that, to answer your question, I think the genius has to be far enough outside of the mainstream to see something different, but to be close enough inside and to be living in a culture and a time that is receptive enough to it so that their ideas resonate. It's sort of the sweet spot being between an insider and an outsider. Yes. Yes.
So in your research, what are the common reasons that you found behind the decline of these genius clusters?
One word: arrogance, I think. A historian talked about ancient Athens and why it eventually declined, and he spoke of a creeping vanity, which I think is a good term, because vanity doesn't hit you over the head. It sneaks up. You don't wake up one day you're an arrogant jerk. It takes years to get there, but people do it. And I think that, once you're arrogant, you've lost your ignorance, right? You know it all. So you've lost that openness. You do need to be self-confident, but you need that combination of self-confidence and ignorance. And I find that these places, they become arrogant. And there's an interesting theory by an anthropologist named Alfred Kroeber in the 1940s, and he talked about what he called configurations of culture growth, which is a terrible term, but what he meant was essentially that cultures are like kitchen cupboards. You have so many ingredients to combine them in different ways. And if at a certain point you don't import more ingredients, you're going to run out of combinations. And that's when cultures start to just plagiarize themselves. That, combined with arrogance, I think, leads to the decline. Yes?
I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Looks like you're reading it already. This is great.
I'm curious to know, just your comment on why you called Silicon Valley weak.
Yeah.
It's genius. And then secondly, is that the only genius cluster you see in North America, or have any hope for any other genius clusters in North America?
Aren't I standing in one right now? Let me answer the second question first. I wanted to have one chapter on North America. I like the way you say North America. Are you Canadian? No. Okay, but up here we're close enough. We're close enough to Canada. We could say North America, good, not just America. And I thought about New York and the art scene in the 50s and 60s, and I thought about New Orleans and jazz. Thought about Detroit and the automobile. Thought about Hollywood and film. But I thought that Silicon Valley epitomizes the American flavor of genius. And why did I call it Genius is Weak? Because there was a paper, a sociological paper written in the 1970s by a at the time young sociologist named Mark Grenovetter, and it has gone on to become the most cited paper in all of sociology, and it's called simply The Strength of Weak Ties, The Strength of Weak Ties. And he argues, very in plain English, that having weak ties, knowing a lot of people but not knowing them that well, can actually be helpful in social settings and when it comes to creativity. And I realized how that theory sort of explains Silicon Valley. People, to be honest, don't have such deep relationships, but they know a lot of people. They have lots of contacts. I suppose we call it networking. And Facebook, one of the products of Silicon Valley, sort of mirrors that, right? Mark Zuckerberg didn't invent weak ties, but he made them cheaper and easier to have. So this is, that's sort of the theory behind Silicon Valley, is that it's actually these weak ties that explain its greatness. Yes?
So speaking of Silicon Valley, you said that some of these places, they had sort of a challenge or they were difficult, whether it was the weather, whatever. There's nothing easier than the Bay Area. So how do you account?
Yeah, that's a good question. I hate when people point out potential contradictions. But I'm not going to give up. I think that the challenge was simply being in California I trace it back to 1912. I trace Silicon Valley back to the sinking of the Titanic. Bear with me. So in 1912, the Titanic sinks. And after that, a few months later, Congress passes a law requiring radios aboard all ships. Well, there was a nascent radio was a brand new technology. It was the digital technology of its day. There was a nascent radio industry in Palo Alto and in Silicon Valley, and it took off after that. And along with it, a lot of amateur radio operators, hams, and that whole culture of tinkering and that sort of thing. And back then, of course, California, the whole West Coast, what do historians say about it? It was created modern, or some term like that. It was tabula rasa, and they had a chip on their shoulder, right? So when Leland Stanford, the senator, founded Stanford University, a New York paper sniffed, and I'm quoting almost exactly here, California needs an elite university the way Switzerland needs a retirement home for sea captains, Ouch. So I think the difficulty was we're out here, we're a long way from the centers of power and knowledge and money, and we have a chip on our shoulder. Not the microchip, wasn't invented yet, but that chip to prove ourselves. So I think that's what they had to push against, was their otherness and being out there, and their irrelevance in a way. Yes?
I read your first book,
Okay.
The Geography of Bliss, and really enjoyed it. And I'm wondering if you, in your research, if you found any parallels or a confluence between these countries or cities.
Happy places and genius places?
Yes, or exact opposite.
What would the Venn diagram look like? Would there be overlap? To be honest, not to pick on Switzerland in this case, but Switzerland did appear in the Geography of Bliss, but not in the Geography of Genius. First of all, are there any Swiss people here? Okay, good. So Graham Greene famously or infamously said of the Swiss, 500 years of peace and stability, and what have they brought the world but the cuckoo clock? Now, first of all, the cuckoo clock was actually invented by a German, a Bavarian, but there is chocolate. But the point there being that, Switzerland is a very content place, but not a particularly creative one. I don't think that you need to be a miserable person living in a miserable place to be creative. One of my favorite responses to this very question was actually in my first book, The Geography of Bliss, when I'm in Iceland and I'm sitting down with Hilmar. Hilmar's a heathen, but that's his religion, that's fine. The Nordic religion. He's also a composer of classical music. He was one of Björk's mentors. He's a very successful musician, very creative. His music is haunting and beautiful. And I said, Hilmar, you seem like a pretty happy guy, yet you've created, so much art. And usually, I think that, artists need to be unhappy and miserable. And he said, well, I am basically happy, but I cherish my melancholia. And that's stuck with me as explaining a lot about the relationship between sad people in places and their art. You can be happy, but you need to have this side of you that is melancholic and that you don't reject, that you cherish in the right way. So, yes.
Since we are talking about Venn diagrams and geography of bliss, actually there is one, India, which did feature in geography of bliss and is
You're right. Yay, India.
Chaotic, yeah.
Yes. And India has such a wide spectrum of everything, the best and worst of humanity. And I did subtitle the chapter on Calcutta, Genius is Chaotic. Because, but the thing is about the chaos of India, as a Western, when you go there the first time, it looks like total chaos. But Indian friends will say, no, there's a hidden order. That chaiwala is always there on top of that elephant or whatever. You know, it looks crazy, but there's a reason to it. And I think India could probably feature in every book I write, because there's a lot to say. Yes?
So I'm curious about your opinion on hiring diversity to offset specialization. Like, does that, so having a diversity of background, of ethnicity, of experience, even if people are still specializing in computer science or specializing, like if you have a bunch of doctors, right? If they all come from different places,
Yeah.
don't they bring? Does that offset? Or
Well, when I talk about diversity, I really mean diversity of ideas.
Right.
And of course, you can have ethnic diversity, but have everyone thinking exactly the same. But you're right. If you have someone from China and someone from India, they're probably going to bring different thinking along with their different ethnicity. And I realize that specialization is to some degree necessary in our world. But the issue I have is people not talking to one another. That in all these other places I looked at, these golden ages, there were conversations between economists and sociologists and physicists, because these fields were so young that the fortresses that they built around their little quadrants of knowledge had not yet been solidified and fortified. So I think you can have the degree of specialization necessary, but it sort of should be the minimum required, and then you should be talking to one another. And in 19th century and early 20th century Vienna, you know, I sat down with a physicist there today, and he said back then he was reading some papers from physicists back then, and they were entirely readable and understandable to a layperson, which is not really the case today. I disdain jargon. I think that it stands in the way of creativity and progress. Yes? Okay. And that goes to you. Congratulations. What did she win?
So I'm kind of sad face hanging on the statement you said about the chance of genius in today's world. And I've been thinking about the things that you think fosters genius, like difficulty, strife, or
constraints.
You know, different audiences or receptivity to certain things. And I think about like the accessibility of knowledge today with the internet and the masses of everybody. And there definitely is strife everywhere in the world. And so to me, that seems like a perfect breeding ground for genius.
Right. I didn't mean to sound to make you sad face so much. Is that a verb, by the way, to sad face? Oh yeah, I like that. Sad facing. Okay. Well, I believe that if the availability of knowledge were a prerequisite for genius, then everybody would be a genius, because we have more. You're right. We have more access to knowledge today at our fingertips, literally, than any people have ever in the history of humanity. But again, I don't think that creativity and creative genius is about knowing more. It's about seeing more. And if our minds and our field of vision is cluttered with an excess of data not being information not being knowledge not being wisdom, then we're less likely to make connections, because we're not able to see through the fog of data. I think that's one potential problem. You're right, there is strife in the world. One counterintuitive finding is that war is bad for creativity. Some people would say, you know, what about radar and other innovations? And it's true, some have come out of war. But how many geniuses are coming out of Syria right now? Not that many, because all-out war is actually bad for creativity. But you're right, there is strife in the world, so maybe there's hope. for creative genius. I don't know. I do know that where are the Darwins and the Einsteins of today? I think I conclude in the book that we get the geniuses that we want and that we deserve. And I think a good example is take a look at a Mozart or a Beethoven. People will look around today and say, where is the Mozart or Beethoven of today? And there is none, because if you're young and ambitious, you're probably going to head out here or to Silicon Valley or to Wall Street, because that's where the recognition is. That's what society says is important. And even if you buck that trend and go on to become a classical composer, a Thomas Adès, a name that most people here won't know, but who is the greatest probably composer of our day, you don't get that recognition, right? So you don't, we get the geniuses we want and we deserve, and you can't separate the creative act from the recognition. And what do we care about today? We care about technology. So we get, can I say Steve Jobs in this audience? Okay, we get like a Steve Jobs or a Mr. Gates, because, I'll end just where I began, which is the epigraph in my book, that little quote in the beginning. And I chose just a very short one that really just says it all and says what my book is all about, my ideas are all about. What is honored in a country will be cultivated there. It's from Plato. What is honored in a country will be cultivated there. So if you want to see what kind of geniuses we're getting, you just have to ask, what do we honor? What do we really honor? And that's what we'll cultivate, and ultimately that's what we'll harvest. So thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.